Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we're going to be looking into something that's, well, kind of taken over the internet lately.
What's that?
The Sigma male.
Ah, yes. I've definitely seen that floating around.
Yeah, it's everywhere. You know, that lone wolf kind of guy. Super self-reliant and mysterious.
Right, often contrasted with the alpha male.
Exactly. And it's gotten crazy popular. Like just this year, the hashtag has gotten something like 46 billion views on TikTok. It's wild.
That is a lot of views.
It's huge. But honestly, it feels like it just came out of nowhere.
It's definitely had a you might call a meteoric rise.
Yeah, exactly.
But you're right, it didn't just appear out of thin air. It's actually been bubbling under the surface for a while now. A lot longer than most people realize.
Oh, really? So where did this whole thing even start?
Well, we got to rewind all the way back to 2010.
Okay, back to 2010.
There was this alt-right blogger named Voxday. He actually coined the term Sigma male in one of his blog posts.
So right from the start, it's coming from a pretty specific and kind of controversial corner of the internet.
That's a really good point to bring up. The term definitely has some, let's say, ideological baggage.
For sure.
So then a few years later, in 2014, a plastic surgeon named John T. Alexander wrote a book called, get this, The Sigma Male, What Women Really Want.
Hold on. A plastic surgeon.
Yeah, a plastic surgeon.
Now that's an interesting connection. So it seems like right from the get-go, the Sigma male was tied to this idea of attractiveness in dating.
Absolutely. And that framing has definitely stuck around.
Interesting.
So after Alexander's book, things were pretty quiet for a while. But then between 2017 and 2018, you started seeing the term pop up more and more on YouTube.
Ah, so YouTube's where it started to pick up steam.
Exactly, and mostly in those self-improvement kind of videos.
Oh, I can see that.
And you guessed it, a lot of content about the alpha male.
Right, so the Sigma was kind of positioned as the opposite of the Alpha.
Yeah, at least in those circles. But it still hadn't hit the mainstream yet. Right.
The real turning point came in 2021.
Okay, so what happened in 2021?
Well, a YouTuber named Lily Simpson tweeted about the whole Sigma male thing, and it went viral.
Ah, so that's when it really blew up.
Yep, suddenly everyone was talking about it. And it's interesting because that same year is when we see the term first appearing in Google Trends.
Wow, so a single tweet took it from a kind of niche idea to a global phenomenon. It's kind of crazy how fast these things can happen online. We went from a blog post to, well, 46 billion TikTok views in just over a decade.
It really shows you the power of social media, right?
Yeah.
Ideas can spread like wildfire in the digital age.
Definitely. Okay, so we've got the timeline down. But what exactly does a Sigma male look like? Like, who are the poster boys for this archetype?
That's where things get interesting.
Yeah.
Often they're associated with fictional characters.
Oh, like who?
Like Patrick Bateman from American Psycho. You know, the Wall Street guy.
Right. Super cold and calculating. It's kind of fascinating that a character like that is seen as, like, aspirational. Yeah, it is pretty interesting, isn't it? Another popular example is Tommy Shelby from Peaky Blinders.
Oh, yeah, I can see that.
He's got that brooding, charismatic energy.
Yeah, he fits the mold. That quiet intensity, the mystery, it all tracks. But it's not just fictional characters, right? There are real-life Sigmas, too.
Oh, absolutely. Celebrities like Ryan Gosling, for example.
Yeah.
He often gets labeled as a Sigma.
Okay, yeah, I can see that, that strong, silent type. But here's where things get a little tricky for me.
How so?
Well, you're telling me that people like Andrew Tate, who's known for, let's just say, controversial views,
Right.
are also considered Sigma males.
That's right. And that's one of the big criticisms of this whole concept.
Yeah, it seems like if you're lumping Ryan Gosling and Andrew Tate into the same category, well, that's definitely problematic.
It is.
And it makes me wonder if this whole Sigma thing is less about genuine self-discovery and more about just fitting into some predetermined box.
That's a very valid point. It really raises questions about, well, what this label is actually doing. Is it helpful? Is it harmful? Is it just a way to, like, categorize people without really getting to know them?
Right. Like, is it actually empowering to embrace the Sigma label, or is it just another way to put ourselves and others in a box? Especially when you've got figures as different as, you know, Patrick Bateman and Ryan Gosling. You're kind of glossing over a lot of nuance.
You're absolutely right. And that actually leads us to some of the major criticisms of the whole Sigma male concept. A lot of people point out that using fictional characters and celebrities as these models for masculinity Well, it sets some pretty unrealistic expectations.
It's like you're holding yourself to these impossible standards.
Yeah.
You're comparing yourself to people who are literally created to entertain.
Yeah.
And a lot of those standards focus on these really specific traits, like how you look or being super stoic and aloof. It seems like a recipe for feeling inadequate.
It definitely can be. And it's so important to remember that those figures are often, well, idealized versions of masculinity. They don't show the complexities of real people. Plus, not everyone can be a Patrick Bateman or a Ryan Gosling. They represent these very specific and often unattainable personality types and looks.
And of course, we can't forget that this whole thing came from the manosphere, which I gotta say definitely raises some red flags.
You're right. The manosphere, for those who might not be familiar, is this network of online communities that promote a very particular and some would say harmful view of what it means to be a man.
Right. It's been criticized for its misogynistic views and this idea that men need to reclaim their dominance. So when we're talking about the Sigma male, we can't just ignore that context. It's not just a random label. It's connected to some potentially damaging ideologies.
Exactly. And there are some experts like Beth Skorecki, the health editor at Lifehacker, who are really vocal about this. She even called the Sigma male well, I'll quote her here, bullshit concept from the incel world.
Wow. Strong words.
Yeah.
And for anyone who might not know, incel refers to basically a subculture of men online who are involuntarily celibate. And they often have a lot of resentment towards women.
Yes, and the point Skorecki is making is that this whole Sigma male thing can actually be used to justify some pretty unhealthy attitudes and behaviors. It can be a way to, rationalize misogyny or a sense of entitlement.
It's not just about setting unrealistic standards for men. It's about potentially spreading these harmful views about women and relationships.
Exactly. It's so important to be aware of those potential downsides.
But I've also seen people using the term Sigma male in a more, well, lighthearted or ironic way, like they're kind of poking fun at the whole manosphere culture and all those over-the-top masculine archetypes.
That's a really interesting point because, yeah, not everyone who uses the term is buying into the toxic side of it. There's definitely this trend of using it satirically.
Right. It's like they're reclaiming the term and using humor to critique the very ideas it's supposed to represent.
Exactly. It's like social commentary, using humor to point out those flaws in that type of thinking.
So it seems like there are two sides to this coin. On the one hand, there's this potentially harmful ideology rooted in the manosphere. But on the other hand, there are people using the term ironically to challenge those very ideas.
It's a really interesting dynamic, and I think it reflects a bigger conversation happening about masculinity in the digital age. There's this pushback against those traditional ideas of what it means to be a man, but that pushback can manifest in lots of different ways, some more productive than others.
It's like we're all trying to figure out what healthy masculinity looks like in the 21st century, and the internet can be both helpful and harmful in that process.
I like that. It's this in-between space where we're all figuring things out. The internet gives you access to information and all these different perspectives, which is amazing. But it also exposes you to a lot of misinformation and, yeah, those potentially harmful ideologies.
It's not just about the content itself, but how you engage with it. You can't just passively absorb information, especially when it comes to something as complex as masculinity. You have to think critically, question things, be aware of those potential biases.
I couldn't agree more. It's so important to approach any topic with a critical eye. Don't just accept things at face value. Look for different perspectives. Consider where the information is coming from and be open to challenging your own assumptions.
So what does all of this mean for our listeners? What's the main takeaway from this deep dive into the Sigma male?
I think it's a reminder to be really critical of information, especially when it comes to something as important as gender and identity. Don't get swept up in trends or labels without understanding where they come from and what they represent.
It's about being mindful of the language we use, the things we watch and read, and the messages we internalize. And it's about recognizing that these conversations are ongoing, they're complex, there's no easy answer.
Exactly. It's about thinking about these ideas in a thoughtful way and being open to those nuances and, being willing to question our own assumptions.
This has been a really insightful conversation. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of this topic.
I agree. There's so much more to explore.
So, wow, where do we even go from here? We've gone through the whole history of the Sigma male.
We have, from its origins to its characteristics, the figures associated with it, and yeah, some pretty heavy criticisms.
Right. So much to unpack. So For our listeners, what would you say is the biggest takeaway from all of this?
I think the biggest thing is, well, it's a reminder to be critical, especially online with all this information flying around.
Right, be a critical consumer.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in those trends or labels,
Yeah.
but you really gotta, like, dig deeper.
It's like we've been saying this whole time, right?
Yeah.
Don't just take things at face value. Question those assumptions. Look for different viewpoints. Be aware of the biases.
Exactly. And when we're talking about something as complex as masculinity, well, those oversimplified labels and categories can be really misleading.
Yeah, the Sigma male might seem appealing at first glance, but it doesn't really capture, well, the full picture of what it means to be a man.
It really doesn't.
It's like you're trying to cram this multifaceted, like constantly evolving idea into a tiny little box.
A tiny little box with some baggage attached.
Right, and that baggage can be harmful stereotypes, unrealistic expectations, even some pretty dangerous ideologies.
You hit the nail on the head.
So if we're moving away from these rigid labels, what does, like, a healthy and nuanced understanding of masculinity even look like?
Ooh, that is the question, isn't it? And honestly, I don't think there's just one answer, but I do think recognizing that masculinity isn't, a fixed point, that's important. It's a spectrum.
A spectrum.
Yeah, a journey, an evolution.
I like that. It's about embracing individuality, respecting different ways of expressing masculinity, challenging those norms that hold us back.
Exactly. And it's also about, talking about it openly and honestly, like we're doing now.
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about, like a whole new perspective on the Sigma male and, well, just masculinity in general,
Yeah.
especially in the digital age,
That's great to hear. And I hope our listeners, well, I hope they feel empowered to keep exploring these ideas and form their own conclusions.
Expert speaker, as always, thank you for sharing your insights.
It was my pleasure, truly.
And to our listeners, we'll leave you with this. How can we move past these limiting labels and create a more inclusive and empowering understanding of what it means to be a man? Keep those questions coming, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.